On the evening of November 17, 2015, the opulent neighborhood of Kensington was shaken by a brutal crime that shattered the illusion of security and luxury. The stately mansion of billionaire tech mogul Ethan Gray became the scene of a murder that would reveal a tangled web of deceit, lust, and betrayal. Ethan Gray, 48, was a man who seemed to have everything: fortune, fame, and a beautiful family. He had built a multi-billion-dollar empire from scratch, pioneering groundbreaking advancements in artificial intelligence. To the world, he was the epitome of success, a man who could do no wrong. But behind the gilded walls of his sprawling estate, Ethan harbored dark secrets. Ethan's wife, Isabel Gray, a former model turned philanthropist, had stood by his side through every triumph and setback. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter, both away at boarding school. Their life appeared picture perfect, but appearances can be deceiving. It all began when Maria Sanchez, a 26-year-old housemaid, entered their lives. Maria had come from a small town in Mexico, seeking better opportunities in the United States. She was hard-working, kind, and always discreet. The Grays treated her well, and she quickly became a trusted member of the household staff. Ethan, often absorbed in his work and struggling with the pressures of his business empire, began to notice Maria. Her youthful energy and attentive nature were a stark contrast to his strained relationship with Isabel, who had become more focused on her charity work and social obligations. What started as a harmless attraction soon turned into something much more dangerous. Ethan began finding reasons to be home more often, coinciding with Maria's cleaning schedule. He would strike up conversations, compliment her on her work, and offer her small gifts. At first, Maria was flattered, but soon the attention made her uncomfortable. Ethan was relentless, though, and gradually his charm wore her down. The affair began in the summer of 2015. They were careful, ensuring that no one would suspect their illicit relationship. Ethan lavished Maria with expensive gifts and whispered promises of a better life. For a while, they indulged in their secret romance, meeting in hidden corners of the mansion, while Isabel was away at charity events or social galas. But as the months passed, the thrill of their forbidden relationship started to wane. Maria, burdened by guilt and fear, began to pull away. She wanted out, but Ethan wouldn't let her go so easily. He had become obsessed, his infatuation turning into a dangerous fixation. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, and his once gentle demeanor gave way to possessiveness and anger. The tension between them escalated, and Maria confided in a close friend, another maid who worked at a neighboring estate. She told her friend that she feared for her life, that Ethan was becoming increasingly erratic and demanding. She planned to leave her job and return to Mexico, hoping to escape the situation before it spiraled out of control. On the morning of November 17th, Maria handed in her resignation to Mrs. Gray, who was surprised but didn't ask too many questions. Isabel simply assumed Maria had found another opportunity. Ethan, however, was furious when he found out. He stormed into the servants' quarters, demanding an explanation. Maria, terrified, stood her ground and told him it was over. That evening, the house was eerily quiet. Isabel had gone to a charity gala, and the rest of the staff had been given the night off. It was just Ethan and Maria in the massive mansion. A confrontation erupted. Ethan begged Maria to stay, promising her everything she had ever wanted, but she was resolute. In a fit of rage, he grabbed her by the arm and shook her violently. Maria screamed, trying to break free, but Ethan, consumed by a blinding fury, wouldn't let go. His world, which he had so meticulously controlled, was crumbling around him. In that moment of desperation and madness, he reached for the crystal vase on the nearby table and struck Maria on the head. She collapsed instantly, blood pooling on the marble floor. Ethan stared in horror at what he had done. The woman he claimed to love lay lifeless before him. Panic set in as he frantically tried to think of a way to cover up his crime. He knew the security cameras would have recorded everything, and the consequences would be devastating, not just for him, but for his entire family and empire. Ethan stood paralyzed, his mind racing as he tried to comprehend the irreversible act he had just committed. The pristine marble floor of the mansion, now smeared with Maria's blood, seemed to mock the perfect life he had constructed. He knew he had to act fast. Every second that passed brought him closer to ruin. He forced himself to move, his hands shaking as he bent down to check for a pulse. There was none. Maria was gone. Panic surged through him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He needed to get rid of the evidence. He needed to make it look like an accident, a burglary gone wrong, anything but what it truly was. Ethan glanced around frantically, his eyes landing on the surveillance cameras. He knew the footage had to be erased, but first, he had to get Maria's body out of the house. He grabbed a set of gloves from the kitchen drawer and pulled them on, his mind working furiously to come up with a plan. He wrapped Maria's lifeless body in a thick rug from the hallway, struggling to control the tremors in his hands. The mansion, with its long corridors and numerous rooms, seemed to stretch endlessly as he dragged her towards the back door. His heart pounded in his chest, every creak of the floorboards amplified in the silence. Once outside, he loaded her into the trunk of his black Mercedes, parked discreetly behind the garage. The cold November air stung his face, but he barely noticed. He knew he had to get rid of the body quickly, before anyone noticed she was missing. He thought of the remote woodland area near the edge of town, a place secluded enough to hide his cry. Ethan sped through the deserted streets, his mind clouded with fear and regret. He drove with one eye on the rearview mirror, half expecting flashing lights to appear at any moment. But the roads were empty, the world seemingly oblivious to the horror he was carrying in his trunk. He reached the wooded area in what felt like a lifetime. The moon hung high in the sky, casting eerie shadows on the twisted branches. He parked the car and stumbled out, his legs feeling like lead. The realization of what he was about to do hit him like a sledgehammer. He was going to bury Maria here, as if she were nothing more than a piece of trash to be discarded. Tears blurred his vision as he dragged her body from the trunk, struggling with the dead weight. He dug feverishly, the cold earth biting into his hands as he clawed at the ground. The hole he managed to dig was shallow, barely deep enough to cover her fully. His muscles burned with the effort, but he didn't stop until she was covered. He smoothed the dirt over her, his chest heaving with sobs that he tried to suppress. Ethan knew he had to hurry. He drove back to the mansion, his mind numb as he formulated the next steps. Back in the house, he went straight to his office, where the security system was controlled. His hands trembled as he deleted the footage from the past 24 hours, wiping away any trace of Maria's presence in the mansion. He knew it wouldn't hold up to a thorough investigation, but it would buy him some time. He spent the next few hours meticulously cleaning the scene. He scrubbed the bloodstains from the marble floor, disposing of the rug and the gloves in a dumpster miles away from his house. He showered, scrubbing his skin raw, as if he could wash away the guilt and horror of what he had done. When Isabel returned from the gala later that night, Ethan was sitting in the living room, a glass of scotch in his hand. He forced a smile, his heart racing as she asked him how his evening had been. He replied with a rehearsed calmness, hiding the turmoil that churned beneath his composed exterior. The following morning, when Maria didn't show up for work, Isabel was concerned but not overly worried. She assumed Maria had fallen ill or had some personal emergency. It wasn't until Maria's friend, the maid from the neighboring estate, called that the alarm was raised. She hadn't heard from Maria since the previous afternoon, and her phone went straight to voicemail. A missing persons report was filed, and the police began their investigation. Ethan watched from the sidelines, his nerves stretched to the breaking point. He had thought he could handle it, but with each passing hour, the walls seemed to close in on him. The police questioned the household staff, combed through Maria's background, and eventually turned their attention to the Grey Mansion. Detective Linda Parker, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for being relentless, led the inquiry. She arrived at the mansion with a team, her eyes sharp and assessing as she introduced herself to Ethan and Isabel. Ethan kept his composure, answering her questions with the same calmness he had practiced in front of the mirror. Detective Parker asked to review the security footage, and Ethan felt his stomach drop. He led her to his office, explaining that the cameras had malfunctioned the previous night and that the footage had been lost. He saw the skepticism in her eyes, the subtle narrowing of her gaze as she nodded slowly. Detective Parker's instincts told her something was off. The calm demeanor of Ethan Gray, the conveniently malfunctioned cameras, and the missing housemaid all pointed to a deeper story hidden behind the facade of the billionaire's perfect life. Over the next few days, Parker meticulously combed through Maria's life. She interviewed her friends, checked her bank records, and traced her last known movements. A pattern began to emerge. Maria had been distancing herself from the Gray household in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. More intriguingly, her closest friend revealed that Maria had been planning to leave the job and return to Mexico. Parker's suspicions grew when she found a series of unexplained deposits in Maria's bank account, all tracing back to an untraceable offshore entity. It was an amount far beyond her usual salary, hinting at a clandestine relationship between Maria and someone wealthy. The detective began to wonder if Maria had been receiving hush money. Parker obtained a search warrant for Ethan Gray's phone and financial records. When she cross-referenced the deposits with Ethan's accounts, she discovered transfers made to the same offshore entity. Her heart raced as she realized the implications. Ethan had been paying Maria, possibly to keep quiet about something. The breakthrough came when Parker discovered traces of blood, barely visible, missed during the initial investigation, in the tiny crevices of the marble floor in the living room. It matched Maria's DNA. The walls were closing in on Ethan. Parker called Ethan in for questioning. He maintained his composure, his lawyers at his side, but Parker could see the cracks in his facade. She laid out the evidence piece by piece: the unexplained deposits, the blood trace, and Maria's friend's testimony about her plans to leave. "You were involved with her, weren't you?" Parker's voice was low, but the accusation cut through the room like a knife. Ethan's expression hardened. "I had nothing to do with her disappearance," he said flatly, but his voice wavered ever so slightly. Parker leaned in, her eyes locked onto his. "You killed her, Ethan. You killed her because she was going to leave, and you couldn't handle it." Ethan's lawyer intervened, pulling his client away from the barrage of questions. But the damage was done. The pressure was mounting, and Parker knew it was only a matter of time before Ethan cracked. Back at the mansion, Ethan was spiraling. The meticulous control he had maintained over his life was unraveling faster than he could manage. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and every knock on the door sent a surge of panic through him. Isabel had grown distant, confused by his erratic behavior and the constant presence of detectives around their home. Then, on the night of November 25th, it all came crashing down. Detective Parker received an anonymous tip. Someone had seen Ethan Gray's car near the woodland area the night Maria disappeared. She raced to the scene with her team, armed with shovels and flashlights, praying that this wasn't another dead end. They found the shallow grave just as dawn broke. The smell of freshly turned earth mingled with the crisp morning air. Parker's heart sank as they uncovered Maria's body, wrapped in the same rug Ethan had used to drag her out of the mansion. The look of fear and betrayal still etched on her face was a haunting testament to her final moments. The evidence was undeniable. Ethan Gray was arrested the next morning, his mansion swarmed by flashing lights and news cameras. As he was led away in handcuffs, the once proud mogul looked like a ghost of himself, hollowed out by the magnitude of his crime. In the interrogation room, facing the mountain of evidence, Ethan finally broke. Tears streamed down his face as he recounted the events of that night. He told Parker how he had been consumed by jealousy and rage when Maria tried to end things. He had never meant to kill her, he said. It was an accident, a moment of madness that he could never take back. But Parker wasn't swayed by his tears. She had seen this before, a man of power and privilege brought low by his own dark desires. She pressed him on the details, extracting every painful admission, every incriminating fact. By the end of the confession, there was no doubt left. Ethan had killed Maria, and he had tried to bury his crime along with her body. The trial was swift. The prosecution laid out a damning case, backed by Ethan's confession and the forensic evidence. His high-priced lawyers tried to argue diminished responsibility, painting Ethan as a man driven to the brink by stress and a failing marriage. But the jury saw through it. They found him guilty of second-degree murder. Ethan was sentenced to 30 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for 20. Isabel filed for divorce immediately after the sentencing, taking their children and leaving the country to escape the scandal. The empire Ethan had built crumbled as investors pulled out and his company's stock plummeted. Detective Parker stood outside the courthouse on the day of the verdict, watching as the media frenzy continued. Another life lost, another family destroyed, all because of a man who thought he could have it all, no matter the cost. She sighed, pulling out her phone to check the latest lead on her next case. Because in her line of work, there was always another story waiting to unfold, another tragedy born from the dark corners of human nature. And for every secret that came to light, there were 100 more waiting to be uncovered.